Good morning. This is House Government Operations and Military Affairs, and it is Wednesday, April 9th, and we are taking up H233 state-funded grants, and we would like to invite former Representative Jonathan Williams to join us in the witness chair. Morning, Jonathan.
Morning. Thank you all for having me. It's nice to see so many familiar faces and some new ones. My name is Jonathan Williams. I thought I'd give some background on my work before I dive into the bill, if that's appropriate. I have been a grant writer and grants manager for 17 years. My first grant I ever wrote was in the United States Peace Corps when I was living in Morocco. I wrote a grant to purchase steel weaving looms from USAID for a women's cooperative, and I've been writing grant applications ever since. Currently, my position is with the Vermont Food Bank, where I am the Senior Grants and Contracts Manager. I've been there for 7 years, though I'm not speaking on behalf of my employer today, only as a subject matter expert. I have also been a town administrator, where I wrote and secured funding for communities in Windsor and Washington County. And I have also founded and administered a nonprofit called the Barrie Community Relief Fund in the wake of the 2023 and 2024 flooding, which saw more than $600,000 distributed to individuals and businesses in my community in the span of 2 years. And I was also a former state representative for Barrie City. So whenever I talk about grants, people sort of glaze over. But what are grants? Grants are the delivery truck for legislative will. They ensure that the things that you budget in the big bill and in the budget adjustment are enacted. They see funding distributed to shelters for unhoused people, funding for schools, funding for hospitals, funding for food shelves and meal sites and food banks. They make sure that people have enough to eat. They make sure that people have a place to sleep. They are a tool. And so you have heard testimony from the administration on this bill, and they have told you that things are going swimmingly, and I'm here to tell you that not all is well in grants world. Nonprofits have folded in the time it takes between a grant being awarded by the state of Vermont and the money getting to that nonprofit. Needle exchange sites, shelters, nonprofits that are dedicated towards encouraging after-school activities. And so this bill is an important one. It is attempting to fix something that many other states have worked on. 13 other states across the United States have implemented grant reform efforts. And I can certainly get a list of those to you as needed. So I thought I would go through section by section. It's not a long bill, thankfully. But what you've heard and then what I am seeing in the field, as it were. Section 1, grant applications and agreements, and addresses indirect rates for nonprofits. This is something that is especially important in the midst of the uncertainty that we are facing at the federal level. My employer, the Vermont Food Bank, is currently dealing with cuts to funding and food from the federal government, from USDA, specifically TFAP foods. Around 20% of TFAP foods have been cut off, and other states have seen some or all of their TFAP foods withheld. Food and funds, those are dealt with through grants. Indirect rates, or admin, is a very boring term, and I know, stay with me, that deals with costs associated with doing business. Admin is utilities and rent and IT and architectural services. It is the cost of operating a business or a nonprofit. Some people conflate lower indirect rates with efficiency, but I'm here to tell you that that is not correct. For example, if, say, a nonprofit operated 3 warehouses across the state rather than 1, your IT rate, or excuse me, your indirect rate is simply going to go up as a matter of course because you pay more in rent and utilities and making sure that foods are not afflicted with pests. Pest control is considered a piece of indirect costs. The feds enforce something called the de minimis or the minimum indirect rate. It was 10%, it's now 15%. The state aligns with that indirect rate, but what federal rule says, and I'm sorry for getting into the weeds. What federal rule says is you can have a higher indirect rate if that's the cost of doing business. You just have to show your math. That is called a NICRA when you have an agreement with the feds to have a higher than the minimum indirect rate. NICRA, negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. The food bank's indirect rate is around 30%, but we are restricted to 15%. Other nonprofit research institutions, indirect rates can be as high as 40 or 50%. The NIH right now has been instructed to restrict all grant funding to the de minimis at the federal level. That is a death sentence to thousands of research institutions across the United States.
NIH standing.
Excuse me, the National Institute for Humanities. Excuse me, alphabet soup, fun. So the state is now saying to you, what this bill does is say, the state grants, you can have a higher indirect rate if you can show your math. That's important because the cost of a higher indirect rate means more flexible funding for towns, for schools, for hospitals. It is more beds in a shelter. It is more food for people who are food insecure. It is flexible. If the money is freed up over here for rent and utilities, they can spend their unrestricted funding on medicine or teachers or a position or volunteers or et cetera. The state has told you, the agency administration has told you that they now allow this through allowing a nonprofit to have the equivalent of a NICRA. But most nonprofits can't handle the amount of work it takes to get a NICRA from the federal government. The food bank does not have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement with USDA, which supplies the feds are about 15% of food bank funding because it's too onerous. So why would we as Vermont have a process by which say, well, you can have a higher than the minimum, but you have to follow this extremely complicated and onerous process. And they say that they have made this available through their rulemaking, but I can attest to you that I have managed multiple state grants in the last year, Dale, DCF, Agency of Education. None of them have in any of their grant agreements or any of the language or emails or conversations I've had with grants managers have told me that we can have a higher than the minimum indirect rate. And it's not in the grant agreement. I checked before I came here. So if they are making that process available, and even if it is onerous in the extreme, they're not being very transparent about it being about nonprofits being able to tap into that. So I would urge this committee to pass this bill, but also specifically make a process by which nonprofits can have an accessible way to prove, if they can show their math, that they have a higher indirect rate, because it is important. And I know it's dry and I know it's boring, but it's important. So please, yes, incorporate language into this section detailing the education of indirect processes to be disseminated more broadly and accessibly, and make that process more accessible than the federal process. And I would urge you to, again, consider the fact that the federal government right now is being very punitive when it comes to language around grant making. And perhaps we can set a better example, as have many other states, New Jersey, Florida. Section 2.
Can I interrupt you?
Oh, absolutely.
Question?
I'm sorry.
Thanks.
Please.
Don't be sorry. I just wanted, before we got too much farther. Um. There's such a difference between what we are hearing from the agency and what nonprofits are saying. And I'm wondering if you could hazard a guess why people are seeing it from such different points of view.
Sure. I would suggest that, I'll use a personal example. Again, I'm going to use my employer. I'm not speaking on their behalf, but it's my life, so I'm going to talk about it. The food bank. I raise hundreds of thousands of dollars from corporations, foundations, in grants for food distribution, produce distribution. I sit in my basement, which is filled with 1980s science fiction film references, and I write grant applications from home. But every month I try to volunteer at the Veggie Van Gogh produce drop at the Barry Auditorium. And hundreds of people drive through that line who are picking up food for families and children and seniors. And there's a huge disconnect between the fundraising or distributing funds and the need in our communities. When I founded the Barry Community Relief Fund, those funds needed to be distributed because people lost their homes, they lost their furniture, their boilers, their cars, and that funding needed to go out quickly. And I'm going to get into this, but I think there is simply, it's difficult to see the end result of what you're doing. Grants is a very boring thing. I get it. But it is the implement, the instrument of legislative will. And so I think there's also an unwillingness to concede that things are broken. That is just human nature. And I do want to thank the hundreds of state employees who do this work, who do go out of their way to make sure that the nonprofits and schools and businesses and towns are well served. And I think we can do better. So I'm going to get into that if that's all right, Representative, with some more examples.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Thank you.
Representative Coffin.
Just a quick one because didn't know what you meant. What are TFAB foods?
I'm sorry. That is alphabet soup.
Yeah.
It's just a federal food program.
Okay.
It's the Emergency Food Assistance Program. It's a USDA food program where government food is essentially. So.
I think we have a couple of.
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me.
Rep Stone, did you have your hand up?
No, I was alerting you. Bill was raising his hand.
Thank you. Rep Nugent, you had your hand up, no?
Just Bill.
Thanks, go ahead.
I was really curious.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's an important program and other states have seen those foods being restricted. It's food and funding. Grants aren't just money. That's an important point. Grants are food. Grants are in-kind contributions. We get grants for pet food. We get grants for dog collars, flea and tick collars, all kinds of stuff. Grants are paving for roads. Section 2 is prompt execution of grant agreements and prompt payment of grant funds. This is a really important section. And I know you've heard some figures from the Agency of Administration that say things are going well. But there are some blind spots that I think they have that are not painting an accurate picture for you all. You heard testimony that the state provides 97.8% of grant payments within 30 days. And frankly, I believe that. But there's an important thing to consider, and that is that state and federal grants, excuse me, are reimbursement grants, which means you spend the money first and then you get paid for the services you rendered. Most grants in the philanthropic and private sectors are not reimbursement grants, and not all federal or state grants are either. Frequently, you just get a check to render services, and that is a far more equitable way of doing things. But And you've also heard that, that 97.8 figure is contingent on nonprofits and schools and overworked town clerks filling out applications correctly, and they're submitted and they get bounced back. That happens all the time. But you have to view that as part of a larger puzzle. And that puzzle is one, those payments are being issued within 30 days, but it can take 30, 60, 90, a year for a grant to be between the time a nonprofit applies and the time a grant is awarded. You heard from ANR that they showed you an example of a grant that was for flood relief, something that is very near and dear to my heart as a Barre resident. They said it took 117 days to issue that grant. I can tell you now that there were 2 100-year floods in the span of 117 days in Barre. And I'm sure in many of your communities, they dealt with similar issues. The speed in which funding is distributed is extremely important, especially when it comes to disaster relief. You're looking at what was BGAP last year, the Business Emergency Gap Assistance Program. Acronyms. I've been out of the game for a while, I'm sorry. That funding needs to get to towns quickly in order to respond and prepare for the next disaster. So I will tell you that a good average nationally for disaster relief is 90 days. That is a good number. That's 3 months. I will tell you that the Barre Community Relief Fund, we were all volunteer board, all volunteer grants review board committee. We turned around funding in 2 weeks for businesses and individual families who were afflicted by flooding. It can be better. It should be better. And so when you add that 30 days on top of 6 months or a year, it becomes detrimental. Nonprofits shutter their doors. We can get you a list of Vermont nonprofits that have closed, needle exchange sites in Chittenden County that have closed because they did not have the liquidity to float the costs of doing business because it was a reimbursement grant.
Yes, Representative Hooper.
So that's what's in front of us, what's behind that. Does the state get money based upon approval of local grants, so they're also getting funded proactively, sort of, or where does the money invest when the way you distribute?
So some of the money that the state is issuing as grants comes from the budget that you vote on and approve. It's general fund monies frequently. Often it is also passed through federal funding. So the feds give it to the state, give it to a nonprofit. It's a timeline wise. And so it's different. Frequently, it is a reimbursement for the feds. I am no expert in that specific level of doing business, but it is sometimes the case where an entity, a nonprofit in Vermont will apply to the state for funding. The state will say, hey, you awarded us USDA for this funding. Give us this money. They give the money to the state and it goes to the nonprofit. Sometimes EPA, HUD, these federal agencies give the money to the state and then the state gives it out. It's different for.
So in some cases, money give out for a while.
Yes.
Other cases.
It very much depends, but I will say that it has been my experience that those monies that are passed through federal monies are often more quickly distributed than state general fund monies. I can say that legislative appropriations to nonprofits have taken 8 months to a year with general fund monies, whereas when we are drawing down USDA funds, it can take a couple of days. What is that? What is the reason for that discrepancy? And there's a broader thing that I'll get to. What is the reasoning, the issue behind all of this? But
Real hand stuff.
Hard to know what are real hands and what aren't.
Yeah, don't envy your.
It's a tough job, Madam Chair.
I just wanted to, I thought it would be helpful if you could reframe or maybe reset that, that I don't think that that's the issue, at least that the state's giving for delayed payments. As far as you know, that they're not, that they don't have the money. They've never said that that was a problem.
No, I would agree, Representative. I don't think that is one of the main contributors to what's going on. I would say some of the issue is in the main issue in terms of why this is a problem for towns and nonprofit groups that are serving vulnerable Vermonters is how long it takes to get a grant agreement in place for a grant agreement to be executed between DCF or VTrans and Pomfret or Callis or a food shelf. It can take months, and really it's not, most of it is boilerplate, but it can take months to simply for two people to sign that document. And it differs between agencies. Each agency and department has a different grant application portal and process and paperwork, and it is all different. And so I have an internal ranking. And now that I'm not a rep, I'm happy to share it. Of which agencies do this work very efficiently and which could use some work. Here's a hint. Agency of Agriculture do a great job. I don't know why, but their grants portal is fantastic. And they offer prompt payment quickly to farmers who were impacted by flooding or for local food purchases. And it's to their credit. But each entity, and that is really a much broader issue that this bill does not address. But my sincere hope is that the working group will take a look at that, because it is a major challenge for overworked select board members or town clerks or town managers to have to navigate through all these different processes. And when you click calculate on one agency's budget page for their grant application, it deletes all of your numbers if you don't click save in 30 seconds. And all these, this is just the cost of doing business maybe, but it is extremely difficult. Many states have reformed their processes so that it's one grant portal and one form, standard form, much like the feds have now. That is something the a previous incarnation of this bill tried to address, but it didn't get very far because it's expensive. And so my hope is someday that is addressed. But for now, I would urge you to look into that because it is a challenge. It is a challenge.
You. Any additional questions? Reps Lawson?
Just a comment, that last part where you were talking about the state portals, I was actually making notes. And are they sent, where you're saying they're all different portals, different grant procedures. Just standardization, I was gonna ask about that. If that would be a.
Thank you for asking that. My dream someday, in the bright, distant, beautiful tomorrow. Hello, Rick. Is that you have one website called vermontgrants.gov. And a town clerk goes there, or a select board member goes there, or a volunteer on the planning commission. And they say, there's a drop-down list and it says, I need money for a town plan. And it says how much, and you fill it out and it's accessible, easy to read language, and you submit it. People applying for these things don't need to know and don't care what agency or department the money's coming from in state government. They don't need to know, frankly. What they do need is the money to have a town plan. That is, I suspect, long way off, though I will tell you that other states have already done that, and it has proven immensely beneficial. If you want more efficient state government, you need to pass this bill. If you want smaller, more efficient state government, if you want state government that is more supportive of marginalized or vulnerable people, older adults, seniors, persons with disabilities, this bill will be beneficial. It doesn't matter how much you spend, 8.8 whatever billion dollars in the state budget, if that money is facing a bottleneck and isn't getting to people in a timely fashion, money not in your pocket isn't worth anything at all. And if we're going to rely on not the nonprofit sector to provide essential services to Vermonters, then we need to make sure that we're doing right by them. And not just nonprofits, again, towns, schools, hospitals, businesses. Many businesses apply for funding. BGAP funding for flooded businesses was for private, for-profit, small town businesses, small business. And so I'll just wrap up there, but I thank you sincerely for your time, and I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Examples of the states that are successfully using the one-stop shop.
Florida, New Jersey, New York has implemented reform processes. My legislative intern last year generated a very comprehensive report on this, which I am happy to share with you all about which states have done this work. It is very important.
Would like,
Absolutely, absolutely.
Great, thank you. Any additional questions for Jonathan?
In doing that, was it mandated legislatively or how did they get to the point where they were forced to do that?
Forced is such a strong word, Representative. Asked, I don't,
Required.
I don't honestly know the answer. I strongly suspect, I would have to refer back to the report that she generated, but I strongly suspect that it was either done by the legislature or by administrative or executive work.
Rep. Nugent?
Just wondering if you had any thoughts about the data collection that's in it too, as far as collecting data around the delayed payments and the reasons for that.
Yeah, I think that is a critically important thing to try to understand. Again, it's wonderful if the state is able to offer payments 97.8% of the time within 30 days. But again, that is not a complete picture of what's going on. That is the case with reimbursement grants, which again are not the norm everywhere. And you have to take that contextually as part of process that is taken, a nonprofit that is fully volunteer staffed or a school fundraising committee, 6 months or a year to generate an application to the Department for Children and Families or the Agency of Education. And their hopes and dreams are riding on that request. And so 30 days, great. 30 days plus 9 months. Is that really how we want to be supportive of these organizations that we're tasking with rendering important services? That is a policy decision for you all.
Any additional questions? Comments? Rep. Coffin?
I would just like to see the list, some of the states that have implemented the
Mm-hmm.
easier policies.
Absolutely.
We get it done. That would give me something to look up and
Absolutely. I'm happy to share that.
get a better depth of it.
Yeah, it's very eye-opening and the federal government also has the name is SF 424, Standard Form 424. It is a standard form that it can have sections tacked on. It's very modular. It's sort of like a car. You can switch out the wheels or whatever. But it is the same at HUD as ACF, as USDA, all these federal alphabet soup agencies. They use the same form because they understand that it is difficult for smaller nonprofits who can't jump through these hoops all the time. And they also have the same reporting forms for when they have to report on how they spent the money. And they have the same budget form. And it's one grant portal for the entire federal government, grants.gov. You have heard of it. Because they understand that it makes things easier for folks.
Thank you. Last call for questions. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
We're going to take a brief break because